Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. My name is Dan Derry, and I'm the president of the Institute of Fulfilled Eschatology. Hey, so we're in the middle of a study on Matthew 24, and we're going to begin to share some thoughts out of verse 29 today. But before we get into the understanding of the metaphorical and the covenantal language of 29 itself, I want to establish definitively that we must place verse 29 in a first century context. In other words, we must see it as being fulfilled in the first century. I know this is basic, I know it's elementary, but listen, those who have not embraced fulfilled or covenant eschatology, they first need to grasp the time context of the text, and then they'll grasp the meaning of the text itself much more readily. Okay? So, to do this, I'm going to read the text, Matthew 24:29, and then we'll jump in and share some thoughts. Jesus said in verse 29, "But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken." Now here's what we need to see. Jesus said, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, etc. Well, what tribulation of what days? Well, let's go back and let's keep it in the context. As usual, Matthew 24, 2-3 sets the context of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Then in verse 15, Jesus tells his disciples, "You will see the abomination of desolation when you see the abomination of desolation." And in verse 21, he says, "Then would be great tribulation." So when they would see the abomination of desolation, then would be great tribulation. And in verse 29, Jesus says, immediately after the tribulation of those days will the sun be darkened, etc. So this places the darkening of the sun, the falling of the stars, etc. in the tribulation immediately following the tribulation of the first century. We have established a first century context for this verse. But watch this. This is not only taught in Matthew 24, Luke 13, but it's taught in Daniel as well. And this is specifically where Jesus is drawing his imagery from and his prophecy regarding the destruction of Jerusalem. Go with me to Daniel chapter 12. Now watch this. Let's read verse 1, and we'll make a connection between Matthew, Mark, and Daniel. Daniel 12 and verse 1. "Now at that time Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as has never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued." So Daniel 12:1 prophesies a time of great distress that has never occurred and will never occur again, that will come upon Israel, the covenant people. Jesus quotes this verse in Matthew 24:21 and in Mark 13:19. Listen how Jesus describes it in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 21. Watch this. Jesus says, "For then will be great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." Okay, so Jesus placed the falling of the stars, the darkening of the sun, etc., immediately following the great tribulation of his days, which he quoted from Daniel 12 verse 1. And Daniel also places that tribulation at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, a perfect parallel with Jesus in Matthew 24 and Mark 13. And let me show this to you. I want to demonstrate how Daniel and Jesus are perfectly harmonious and perfectly agree on the time element of Matthew 24:29. So remember, Daniel 12 verse 1, the time of great tribulation would come upon Israel. Daniel in verse 5 begins to be told when this tribulation would be accomplished. Watch this. Daniel 12, 5-7. "Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river, and the other on the other bank of the river. And the one said to the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, How long till the end of these wonders?" In other words, when will this great time of distress, this great tribulation upon Israel be accomplished? Verse 7, I heard the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever and ever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. So Daniel heard that the great tribulation of verse 1 would be accomplished when the power of Israel, the holy people, was completely shattered. Now listen, the power of Israel was their covenant union with Jehovah. It was their covenant relationship. And when that power was completely shattered in AD 70 through the destruction of the old covenant world and the destruction of the temple, the Great Tribulation was fully accomplished. That's exactly what Jesus says in Matthew 24. The Great Tribulation would be accomplished in his generation, surrounding the events of the fall of Jerusalem. Matthew 24, 1-2, and verse 34. But here's the thing. Jesus and Daniel placed the Great Tribulation as being fulfilled in the first century, but Jesus says that the falling of the stars, the darkening of the sun, the moon not giving its light would occur immediately after the tribulation of those days. That means definitively that the darkening of the sun, the falling of the stars, etc., must have been accomplished in the first century, immediately after the Great Tribulation and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And listen, this is exactly what this heavenly disturbance, this heavenly destruction signified. It signified the removal of the old covenant world. We're going to show this. We're going to demonstrate this clearly in the next handful of videos, okay? But this prophetic and metaphorical and apocalyptic imagery is common, run-of-the-mill prophetic language, which denotes destruction and annihilation of a nation by Jehovah as the judgment of Jehovah. And that's exactly how Jesus is using it in Matthew chapter 24. And watch this. Let me share this one more piece. This is so powerful. Daniel didn't quite understand this time and a half a time, and the shattering of the power of the holy people in his day. We get it now, okay? We can look back on all these texts time together, but Daniel didn't get it. So watch what Daniel says and watch the answer to his question. In verse 8 of Daniel 12, as for me, I heard but could not understand. So I said, my Lord, what will be the outcome of these events? Verse 11, from the time the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation set up, there will be 1,290 days. So Daniel's told that the time and a half of time represented 1,290 days. But that 1,290 days would be initiated through the abolishment of the regular sacrifice. Listen, this is a historical fact. In November of 66 AD, following Cestius Gallus's pillage of the temple gold in Jerusalem, the Zealots abolished sacrifices for the Roman emperor, and they abolished all sacrifices for all Gentiles. And that marked the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy in Daniel 12:11, the taking away and the abolishing of the daily sacrifice, and that began the countdown of the times and a half the time, the 1,290 days. And at the end of that time period, 3.5 years after that event, the power of the holy people was completely shattered. Israel was destroyed by Rome in AD 70, which marked the culmination of the Great Tribulation. And at that time, immediately following those days, and at that time, the stars fell from heaven, the sun did not give its light, and the moon withdrew its light, etc. That means, in that whole time period, the first century generation, Matthew 24:29 would find its full and its final and its ultimate fulfillment. And listen, we'll get into exactly what all that language meant next time on Answers on Eschatology. Bye for now.